Hello, good morning. I'm really happy to be here, and especially following Professor Sheila Mishra's really wonderful and thought-provoking talk, which has made my work much easier. So today, I'm going to speak mainly about the issues which we face, all of us, not only participants, but I have been part of NMMA documentation earlier also, and we all face these issues as regards documentation of stone artifacts. So what I'd like to go into slightly more detail, and this I did in Chennai also, and have some degree of interactivity because there are tools here and we can look at them and discuss what we are going to document. So these are some of the questions which I am going to look at. So firstly, we have this wonderful wealth of stone artifacts across the country, right from the very earliest hand axes and perhaps even older material, right up to the microliths and neoliths and beyond that. So what are we going to do with all this? This is the basic question, okay? And we can approach these stone artifacts from multiple perspectives. One is, of course, the perspective which generally we follow in universities and research institutes. That is to look at it purely from the point of view of such questions. So in our research questions, this becomes, I think, to some extent much easier because we have certain problems in mind, and based on these problems, we seek to understand the stone tool assemblages and address this. But from the point of view of NMMA, you are looking at it very differently. You are looking at it from point of view basically of heritage management, generation of massive databases, which have to have quality control firstly, and secondly, these databases must lead to something which as administrators of the country, you can take some policy decisions on it. Dr. Madhulika explained in the morning the different types of databases that are involved, and so right from the point of documentation, you will need to start thinking about the end product because that's what you are aiming at. It's not that you are only going for research goals. The database can be used very effectively for research as well. And so whatever it is this fundamental basic step that we need to consider. Now, Dr. Mishra has already explained to you, and you know this very well, why stone tools are so important. And there are so, I don't need to go through this again with you, right from technology to subsistence to questions of style to questions of language, teaching, learning, demography. There are so many points and questions which these artifacts can help us address. So this is something we all know. But at the bottom line, which we are going to talk about today, is studying stone artifacts from NMMA. And I'm sure all of you have a copy of this documentation form with you. Is it there with all of you online or some way? So you must have access to this form. And in this form, you see that there are so many aspects which you have to fill in, which are time consuming and also which lead you to think about intricacies of every point. So whether it is a simple point such as provenance, or whether you have the material or the measurements or the description, the photograph, of course, how do you take a photo, and so many other aspects describing this particular artifact. Here I've just blown it up, and this is from what we did for NMMA purposes, right to the physical condition of the artifact and making meaning of it. All right? So I am going to discuss various points just related to your ensuring a better and higher quality of describing and entering this particular form. Okay? So the first question is, obviously, you need to identify what is an artifact and what is not. And for this audience, I really don't need to go into that question at all. Although I have seen forms where a number of artifacts made on quartz are called artifacts, but actually they were natural quartz shatter. So these problems also do come, we do come across these issues. So even though it's very obvious to us that this is an artifact and it's definitely not a natural cobble, but at some times when we get pieces on quartz, or some other types of raw material which also shatter naturally. There are many thermoclastic flakes which have been called flakes. There are natural cobbles which have some thermal fractures in a particular manner and which are being wrongly classified as cores. So even though all of us here realize this, sometimes we need to look twice at the data which we are collecting or documenting. The second important thing is what to choose. Now this is a very big question. For an archaeologist involved in research, every single piece is crucial, including, you know, very cores or waste products or the chips or fragments less than 2 millimeters. For me, these are very more important sometimes than the hand axes. Although there has been a lot of bias in looking at the final product in such as hand axes in collections, especially surface collections. So you'll see museums are full of these hand axes and cleavers, and you'll probably have nothing related to the cores or debitage which is collected. This is a bias of the archaeologist. Now for NMMA, the definition of what is needed to be collected and documented becomes very important, and this is a conceptual decision at the highest level. Once they have decided and told us, okay, because you have, as Madhulika explained, you have a vast amount of things to document. You don't have that much funding, you don't have that much time. So among what we call artifacts, we have to select certain so-called types and then proceed with that. So in the assemblage which I get, I will probably not look at the waste products or the cores for NMMA, even though these are really important for other questions, but I will provide data on the bifaces or the scrapers or something else of that nature. But whatever it is, at present this is the mindset of NMMA, which is fair enough. But when NMMA moves to the next stage of maybe development, probably they can rethink what are the artifacts they wish to document and then go on adding to it slowly, so that at the end of maybe 50 years down the line, you will have a more comprehensive databases of everything in the Indian record. This is of course very far-fetched. The second is which attributes to select. So you have this hand axe here, and there are multiple variables, multiple attributes on any artifact which you need to think about. Now, for the purpose of this form, certain features have been demarcated, which are very important as identification marks and also to give a very general overview of what characterizes this particular tool. For example, when we are studying this hand axe, we'll probably take 50 or 60 variables or attributes. But that's not required for you right now. So which attributes are important? At present, this is designated on the form in terms of measurements or physical state, whether it's broken or the physical condition. But you can again, at a later stage, build on this database. And in fact, your database can eventually, if it is online, have several levels. We discussed this in the Chennai workshop. So maybe in the first stage, you start with clicking on a particular column field, that is say stone artifact, and then that field takes you to specific aspects of stone artifacts which you will go on adding to, and which someone who is documenting a coin may not even bother to look at. So in the course of the development of this online database, these are several levels which can be explored. Right now there is one level of entry which is great because there is a huge amount of data which you need to get in place first. After that, you can spin off in multiple ways and think about how you want to go. Now, again, Sheila ma'am discussed this. In your NMMA form, you have a cultural phase. Now, it's very simple for most people. You write down lower Paleolithic or middle or upper Mesolithic, Neolithic, whatever. There's so many ways to define it. But you should realize, and I will discuss this little later, is that this simple sequence which is given over there is obviously not the only one we can think about. And we will talk about the complexity of having a single tool like this, which you pick up from a museum collection and giving it a cultural phase. Because tools are sometimes time transgressive. They never realized prehistoric populations didn't have a rule saying, okay, now I'll put this away and pull out something else. This is a construct of the archaeologist. And therefore, assigning cultural phase is somewhat simple column, but it has huge implications and we can go very wrong in this, which we have. So we'll talk about this a little. So I'm going to talk about context, which luckily for me, Sheila ma'am has already covered, cultural phase, the necessity of looking at stone tools, not just for the purpose of adding a name to it, but trying to place this tool in its broader context. Then only we'll be able to understand the piece better and therefore document it better. And of course, state of preservation. So this is just what is there on your form. And of course, we'll come to measurements. Now, when you read the archaeological literature, you will see that concepts have changed right from 1863 till today. And we are going on adding and going on changing our approaches towards lithics and towards the study of stone tools. So this is just a small chart looking at nomenclatures, the way in which we have changed our ideas of different nomenclatures or the way in which different concepts have influenced writing. And why is that important? It's obviously influenced the definition of cultural phases and even what we call things, call tools, and the ways in which we have chosen to study them. So we have to always keep this in mind, even though you're finally going to fill up only a simple form. But if you're doing prehistory and if you're looking at stone tools, you have to think about these issues as well. Okay? So first we'll go to context. Now, I'm very happy that Sheila ma'am has discussed this in great detail with all the various complexities. So you find sites in all these different contexts across South Asia. And even though you may think that you don't need to bother about this when you're looking at a stone tool, that is totally wrong. You must understand where it has come from. Now, this is fairly easy when you are working on data which comes from something which you have collected yourself, in which case there is a very strict protocol in the manner of collection, if it's surface or whether it is excavation or whatever the case may be. But once you are working with museum collections, which were maybe collected in the 19th century, and you do not have any knowledge more than a broad, say, okay, this is collected from Madras region. Now, Madras region or even the site of Athrampakam has changed its connotations through time. So when I went to the Cambridge or the other collections abroad and it says Athrampakam, I know based on the morphology of the tool, based on its surface texture, based on its other clues on the surface, that it's probably not from the site at all, but from a broader region which they called Athrampakam or they gave some name. So you have to be very cautious. For that, to understand the position of each tool in its broader context, you must have a knowledge of what Dr. Sheila has already discussed with you. That is the context of the tool, the stratigraphy, the geomorphological background. Even if this is very preliminary knowledge, it's not possible for you to go into details, but you must have a critical look at the object you are examining. If you have collected it yourself, you don't need to worry about it because you will be following a very rigid protocol of documentation. But if you haven't collected it, then you have to be really cautious. For example, in Tamil Nadu, we have so many thousands of prehistoric sites in the region which we have built up a database for, and you have so many different types of geomorphological settings. So the artifacts may be from one site in different sedimentary contexts or from multiple sites, and if I find these myself, I have recorded it very meticulously. If I have not collected it myself, if it is collected in the 19th century, Robert Brucefoot collections, those by K.D. Banerjee, V.D. Krishnaswamy, whoever it may be, I need to understand where it's coming from. So I know, and I see in front of me, I can give you an example from here itself, from the collections kindly provided to me. You have artifacts like this one, where you see it's on quartzite and it's got some whitish staining here. This gives me some clue as to what type of sediment it rested in. Or in this case, where you have a completely different patina, probably coming from a different region. So when you look at museum collections, if it has a proper documentation of the site from which it is coming, you are okay. You can go back and read the literature. But it's never so simple. And mostly in some of the earlier collections which you will be forced to document, you may get a lot of variability in context. So it's necessary for you to understand something of the geomorphology of the region that you are studying. Place your artifact which you are trying to document in the general sequence of what has been described for the region, if such data is available, and then you're one step forward in trying to describe it properly for your NMMA form. Okay, so this is just what we did in Tamil Nadu. Luckily for us, we collected all the tools ourselves. So we have a very good idea of the sedimentary context, whether it's surface or buried or whatever it may be, from which artifacts are collected, and we can look at the impact of these sedimentary processes on the morphology of either one tool, if it's only one around there, or the entire assemblage, or in the case of some sites of palimpsests, where on the same surface you will find multiple time periods just within one visible context. And this is where most people get stuck in trying to build models of cultural sequences or something like that. So for example, if you see these tools on the surface here, I can ask some of you to come up, and you find these together. Tanmay, if you can help. You find, you just can hold it up, it's fine. If you can just hold it up like this. If you find these all together on the surface, something like this. This is very common. You are very unlikely in most parts of at least peninsular India to get a surface site which has only got one cultural phase. In that case, in your documentation or in your understanding of the site, you must be able to read the stone tool in a way to be able to understand whether these are different manifestations of the reduction sequence or whether they represent successive occupation through time. The reason that becomes very important, and I'll come to that a little later, is because our understanding of tool typologies is a constraint imposed by archaeologists. Prehistoric people never thought that, okay, I should stop making hand axes when I'm middle. I should stop making, they never thought like that. This is how we think, and we push things into these categories. So, to understand the tool, this is the background you have to go into. Even before you start documenting, it pays to spend a little time when you are looking at this complicated form here. When you're looking at this form, you have the provenance, which is highlighted there, and you have the date or cultural period. So these two aspects must be thought about very clearly before you proceed further. And I won't go into this provenance aspect in great detail because Sheila has also covered that. The second thing is, when you get any artifact from one site, don't assume it's one time period. A site like Atharampakam, for example, has several layers with different cultures. Now, when you collect from the surface of this site, you see that you will have Acheulean artifacts made on very coarse-grained quartzite, sometimes mixed along with the succeeding phase of Middle Paleolithic artifacts, which are on more fine-grained quartzite. This is because of the way in which the sediments erode and because of the way in which the site has been formed. So what has happened through the years, people have collected from the surface and from the gullies a lot of artifacts, like you see on the table, which are actually coming from 2 or more sedimentary contexts. In this case, there are 8 layers. And the 8 layers, which you can't see underneath, dip in various ways. And when they are exposed on the surface, it looks as all as one. So when you are collecting from surface sites or working on collections from older sites, you must consider the variable contexts of artifacts which can come from one site. It's so self-evident, but there's no rocket science about doing this, but it's fooled me in the past when I go to sites and look at the surface without understanding what is hidden below. And this is fairly common. And this can be also when you come across sites in volcanic ash beds or when you come across cave sites, which, like ma'am just now said, must not be assumed to be pristine. So in all these contexts, including these sites in aeolian deposits in southern India and the famous theories, there is a complex history of site formation which leads to the artifacts being present of certain cultural phases, either in discrete layers or maybe as palimpsests, buried or exposed. And this understanding must be had before you put a name on it, that this belongs to the Acheulean or Middle or whatever. And this is also the case when you look at Neolithic sites. I have on my table here this artifact. So what would you call it? So this one? Celt? This one? Same? What time period would you assign it to? This one? If you have a polished stone celt, what time period would you assign it to? You would say Neolithic? Everybody says that? But these are time transgressive. They occurred right from early sites through time. And if you have something like this, now I just saw this here, what is this? Sure? Are you sure it's a hand axe? Are you sure? 100%. Because of the shape you're saying it's a hand axe. But it's probably not. This might be one of the preforms, like you see in the left side of the picture, in the manufacture of some of these polished stone celts. So the initial stages start off with this on some rock like dolerite and then go forward. So when you are analyzing artifacts, this entire background must be kept in mind, that tools, one, occur in different contexts. When you are collecting them, you have to be absolutely sure of that. And secondly, they are time transgressive. Okay? So either in the form of surface scatters, when you are documenting, the process of documentation has to be meticulous. Every single thing, like Sheila ma'am said, has to be recorded. And the geo-coordinates of the piece and its relationship with other artifacts on the surface, as also with other types of sediments, must be very clear. So here you can see we are even, apart from traditional documentation, test pits, satellite data, we are even using ground penetrating radar. Why? Ground penetrating radar, why at a Paleolithic site? It helps me pick up the beds which are lying underneath in a non-destructive manner, and therefore I can get a better idea of how the surface is behaving as it will, in addition to what is underneath. So there are multiple ways by which you can look at surface collections. And of course you all know that the context of the artifact collected from excavated sites, if you are excavating yourself, must be meticulously done. So and this is a new site which we are digging, and here you can see again there are multiple layers, and there are certain layers which occur at the boundary, contact horizon between something upper and something below. So by knowing the context from which each artifact comes from, I will be able to describe it for your NMMA. Of course my research is a different issue, but from your NMMA in a far more valid and far more meaningful manner. And plus, by this very, very detailed documentation, here we have used photogrammetry, we have used laser theodolites to get the precise position of each and every artifact. I can understand its relationship to the others in a better way. For example, if I just have this simple flake, and for me it's meaningless if I don't know what it is with. So the context of the association of various finds becomes really important, and I can even track the way in which the spatial density per unit area or the association of different types of artifacts changes through time. So this becomes very important when I just have to put down one word on your NMMA form, but to put down one word will actually, it takes us quite a lot of work to decide that one word. And this is quality control for your database. Because if you are handing in a database which is very nicely done and very quick, but at the output level, when it comes to the higher levels of Dr. Madhulika and the entire database, there are issues, then the whole database gets compromised. So it's worth taking a little time to understand these very, very simple basic facts before you proceed further. Okay? So the association. I can get a hand axe with other hand axes, in which case it makes some other meaning. I can get very tiny diminutive hand axes with Levallois codes or with something else, in which case it has a different meaning. And these meaning influences my interpretation of cultural contexts or cultural phases or whatever it may be. So don't ever look at an artifact by itself. Never. This is the fundamental problem we all tend to make. But the artifact must be looked at in terms of its family. The family can be other artifacts, it can be the sediments, faunal remains, whatever it is. This is the way we look at things. Okay? Now, cultural phase. This is a huge problem in India, and this is something which we need to think about very, very seriously as a whole community. This is a traditional diagram where you have the Acheulean for sure, middle, and now you come to late Paleolithic. Now you will say, why late? Some people use the word upper and then Mesolithic for the Holocene. Some use the term microlithic cultures. We have no consensus. So finally, when you're filling in the database, and my entire talk is only for your NMMA, it's not for research. Research, we can debate this in 1,000 articles. It really doesn't matter for you. For you, what are you going to write? So here, I'm not giving you any suggestions here. But this is something which all of us need to have a conference and need to standardize something for India. I don't like the word standardization because that kills a lot of creativity. It kills personal views. But for purpose of database creation, you have to have something. So either you call it, say, microlithic of the late Pleistocene and Holocene, but if you don't have a date, you are in trouble. For example, here, I have some beautiful microliths Avik has given. So Avik knows the context of these, but supposing I were to find this without any other reference point, where can I place it culturally? What would you do? If you found this tiny microblade core, yes, in museums. I'm talking about the practical realities of picking up museum collection or some departmental collection and then trying to document. Where will you place it in terms of cultural phase? So at the most, you can write microblade code and maybe give 2-3 options. If you don't, so that doesn't mean that when the final database is being searched and you write Mesolithic, somebody types in a query Mesolithic, this will come up, when probably it isn't. Probably older. So that flexibility in database creation must be thought about, especially when you are revamping your online website, and must be given an option that this is a microblade core, but I don't know where I'm going to place this as per your column. So this is something which I have no answer for. It's just a point which you must think about. Plus variability across India. So what's happening in Northeast is certainly not what's happening in Tamil Nadu. And supposing you are getting these fossil wood sites, which you are getting in parts of Northeast India, or you are getting artifacts which may look like this, or they're not really representative here, or you get these pieces which are actually roughouts for manufacture of cells, which look like hand axes. I've seen the collections from Arunachal Pradesh. If they were in Tamil Nadu, I would have called them a hand axe. But because I know the context, I know that they belong to some very different cultural phase. So you have to factor in this variability. It's very easy for us to do that individually, but for a national database, this is mind-boggling. It's extremely difficult. You have to control for all this regional variability in the lithic assemblages across. Of course, you have this association with hominins, but I don't think we need to worry about that too much, because luckily for us, we don't have many fossils. I'll say luckily because we tend to think too much about fossils and less about the tools, which are equally important. But somewhere in your mind, this background to the study of lithics must be there, so that when you are looking at any stone tool which you have collected, you must be able to place it within this broader perspective of even a very simple understanding of the story of human evolution and the complexity of association of species with tools, at least from the middle onwards, where we really don't know. Okay? So now, let's take a break, and some of you can come up and assign a cultural phase to these artifacts. Come on. This one. That's a hand axe, okay, but let's not worry about the type. So if I put this together and this together, both have been called hand axes. I'm not so sure about this at all, because the way in which it is flaked, the raw material, everything appears to be something different. Or if I put this together and this together, and straight away I write Acheulean, this may be completely wrong, because these type of hand axes can be found later as well. Okay? So when you are assigning a cultural phase, you have to be very, very cautious. Similarly, if you have a piece like this, what would you call it? Blade? Straightforward? But many of these elongated laminar flakes do occur as part of biface thinning. So if you have an assemblage with a lot of hand axes around and you get a lot of pieces like this, you should not say that perhaps there are two cultural phases at this site. You have to be very cautious, and you have to look at the technological aspects of why this is where it is. Okay? So this is something which, as I said before, this is one view which we are all taught in textbooks, need not necessarily be the correct view, and there must be some urgent debate on these terminologies. To make matters worse, this terminology has also come into Indian literature, which actually was drawn up for some completely different scheme, and it had an implication technologically. Unfortunately, it is used now in terms of a chronological or cultural phase-wise thing, but you will find this also in some literature, and therefore it really makes a situation far more complex. In your database creation, which is the key for NMMA, you therefore land up now with a large number of sites, and you land up with a large number of cultural phases, which you have now roughly identified. Whatever the problems, forget that. And now you have to move on to bigger questions. Now, if I find something like this, what do you call it? Chopper? Where would you place it? Not necessarily. This is again a time transgressive tool. But these choppers and simple flakes like this have also been used to categorize sites as being something really very old. So that comes to the question of whether in the areas which you are surveying, do you have anything which is pre-Acheulean or which is something called Old One? And there have been claims from several sites in Pakistan and also in Chandigarh that this phase exists in India. Now, there have been debates on whether it about these particular sites. I won't go into that, but if you just have a look at the lithics which are there, these are something which you can get at any time period, and because of the context of the lithics and the dates, they are giving it some pre-Acheulean characterization. Not that I'm saying that there is nothing before Acheulean in India. I'm not saying that at all. There probably very much is. But I'm just saying that in your surveys, when you come across single artifacts, which may be very simple flakes or choppers, and why I'm raising this point, because I've seen forms in which people have written this. And I've seen articles where people have characterized a pre-Acheulean based on a presence of a few flakes and choppers, which is something which you must be cautious about. Now, you have no doubt that there is an Acheulean, and these are the Acheulean worlds across from Europe to now even Korea maybe, and of course Indonesia. And you have no doubt about various aspects of these bifaces and the fact that you have numerous Acheulean sites. These are a few of the excavated, dated sites only. I've put there are thousands more across the country. So, okay. And then you have the whole issue related to the Middle Paleolithic, where there is a completely different technological strategy used, and of course different artifact types, which signify another major change in behavior and modes of adaptation, with gradual transitions, which that's what at least I believe, in which you have a gradual change from something which is based on very large cutting tools and these large hand axes to adoption of different modes of technology. Mind you, there is no sharp line saying that now I've stopped being Acheulean and now I'm middle. Nothing like that. There is a gradual thing. And at some sites like Athirampakam layer 5 in particular, and I'm sure there are many across India, you have this process in which you have a lot of elements of the older stuff and some elements of something new coming up, which in fact K.D. Banerjee mentioned way back in time. That's an aside. But when you are looking at tools in context, you must keep this in mind. Okay, sometimes the answer you have to fill in the sheet is not very simple. And then, of course, you have this transition to microliths and the late Paleolithic, which Sheila ma'am has spoken about already. So this is the data which you have, culminating in these polished stone artifacts, which have their own very complex history and trajectory of manufacture. And in the early stages of production of some of these polished stone cells, you will get another number of artifacts which you can mistake as being Lower Paleolithic. Recently, we worked on site complexes in Tamil Nadu, which were called Lower Paleolithic for a very long time. But when we went there, we noted that not only is the sediment different, the raw material is also different, and the way of manufacture in the initial stages differ from the way in which hand axes are actually flaked. So even though we don't look at the final polished stone stone tool, we get the manufacturing debris, we are able to identify a very correct cultural phase, or at least a technological phase, looking at the modes of manufacture of these artifacts. So that leads us to technology. From the field, now you are going to the lab, and you have a problem, new types of problems which now arise. Okay? So you are all aware of all these terms here, so I won't go into all that. But the first issue, as I said earlier, spotting the artifacts. So which ones would you call artifacts here? And which ones would you not call an artifact? What about this? I don't know whether this is marked. This one, the first one. This one. Would you document that for NMMA? Would you call it an artifact or not? Not. Why? Okay, so none of you would call. What about the next one? Yes or no? That's all. No. Is it an artifact or not? Yes. Right? Yes or no? No. Okay. What about this? Just because I've got the scale there. Okay. What about these? Yes or no? Yes. And this? Yes or no? No. Okay. This, you have a whole cluster here in that last image on top. Here. Yes or no? Come on. So the answer is all are artifacts. Everything. Right from the first one, which is a hammerstone, to the core, to that cluster of hammerstone and flakes, to the biface over there, the waste products, and that small waste flake. All are artifacts. But in NMMA, now you are being asked to make a choice. And that is the most, in my mind, the most difficult choice to make. And it depends again on the thinking of the database managers as to what they want and what they don't want. So even though I get all this from my sites, I choose only the biface. Personally, I feel the codes should also be added, but that might become too much. Okay? So when you are looking at an artifact which you have to characterize, the next thing is the raw material. So what raw material would you call this? Anyone can come up here, and actually there's quite a diversity of raw materials on this table. You have from the quartzites, you have dolerite, you have some siliceous material, and you have quartz. So when you are looking at the tool, it's not only not good enough to only say this is on quartzite or quartzitic sandstone or whatever. You have to think of the blank from which this was derived. Was it made on a slab? Was it made on a cobble? Was it made on a flake? Was it made on a, just some boulder, knocked off from a boulder? What is it made on? Or just some other debris? So this is the second thing which you have to look at. And the clues to that come from the cortex covering the artifact. So when you look at the artifact, you can look at the areas which have the original cortical covering, and you can look for other clues as to whether it has a bulb or whether other attributes of flakes, and make some rough decision as to what it is made on. Why am I saying what it's made on is important? Is because that leads you to the next stage of being able to describe your artifact. So you have to identify certain clues on the tool which will give you a hint not only as to what it where it falls, but also on the important question of how you are going to measure it. So NMMA has a classification on measuring, a form where you have to measure it. So unless you know where the bulb or the striking platform are, as in this case I'm holding in my hand, this way, you will probably, some people take the measurement this way, some people take measurement this way, or whatever the case may be, which lands the database in a big mess. So that is why at the first stage, after you identify your rocks and raw material, you must identify what they are on and look at the basic form. Similarly, you look for various other signatures. In the case of cores, you are not really concerned. But in the case of hand axes, you may look at the flake scars for some diagnostic marks, which you have another column for. So you need to read the artifact in a far better way. To do so, you need to understand the life cycle or the reduction sequence. So I have with me this in my hand. But this is only the last stage, the last part. It's like your dead body after you are died and then you are not fully buried. But before that, you have a birth, you have a growing curve, and then you enter the archaeological record. This is when it enters the archaeological record. To understand this, I have to go back to where it starts from. And to some extent, I have to understand the technology by which this particular artifact was made. And then only can I proceed to do other fancy things, fancy statistics with the data, or whatever the case may be. Or also look at the lithic artifacts, small tools, and do various things. So first, raw material, which we have in India a whole lot. If you can't identify the raw material, say you have something which is very, very patinated, and you just can't make out. This to me looks like some form of dolerite, but supposing I can't, it's really in a bad condition. In that case, it's always safer to say unclear, rather than put some raw material which you feel it may be. Otherwise, the database goes wrong, and somebody searching for, say, quartzite artifacts will get, hundreds of counts more than what is really there. So I would be very cautious. If I can't identify, leave it, or ask someone. If they can't, leave it. Okay? If you know the site context, like Sheila ma'am spoke about, you must know where these raw materials are sourced from. Why? That will help you in trying to understand this one tool which you're trying to decode. So if I know this is on a cobble, it's on a quartzite cobble, and if I know the context of the site, say this is found from, I think, where was this found from? This is, yes, see, he's right. This is found from a layer with microliths, but somewhere in the vicinity, in some published report on that site, you may get some clues as to where the rock sources are. So this gives you another clue for decoding this particular artifact in your form. So for example, here we know that raw materials are very carefully chosen, we know they have different properties, and we know where the source is, and then we can move one step forward in understanding how they were made. Okay? We know the properties of the rocks. You don't need to go into great detail in this, but it's always useful when you are looking at rocks to have some idea in mind. And then you come to the most important for your background information is the technology by which this particular tool or this blade or these microliths were made. And as you know, this involves a very complex interaction between your concepts of the prehistoric nappers, the techniques and skills that they used to execute it, and there is a sort of a cycle there. But for your understanding, all you need to know is some basics that definitely they used either hard rocks like cobbles, or they may have used some antlers or bone or some other hammerstones, or they may have used some other material, and that they had a range of choices leading to the final production. Okay, so you are not asked to enter the technology in the form, but you are asked to describe the artifact. And when you are describing the artifact, it makes sense for you to look at some of these different ways in which these tools were made. For example, you may have, and I'll just come to some quick videos before I move on. Till then, please ask me if there are any questions. So I don't know why this is not playing. Just hold on 1 minute. Just give me a minute, some problem with the video. Yeah. Okay. So if you have, and if you get in your collection, something that is very unusual and which may have 2 points of percussion on the flake that you're studying, whether it's retouched or not, then you should be able to identify some use of possibly these bipolar techniques. These are very common not only at older sites but also continuing right up to the microlithic phase. So this is something which you should know about, and you should have an understanding as to how the piece which you are now documenting has been manufactured. So in this case, you have 2 points of percussion, very, very different from the traditional flakes which you may have come across, and these pieces were later retouched and made into a number of tools. Okay, so this is one aspect of technology. The other is very, very simple, the slicing of these napping of these large cobbles in successive ways, and the subsequent large flake which was obtained is very, very perfect for making tools like hand axes or even with more sophisticated technology, cleavers or something else. So when you are looking at this particular hand axe, for example, in particular, let me see, I have on the table in front of me, this one. This is made on a characteristic large flake which came from that and subsequently bifacially flaked. So this is also something which you'll need to write down, whether it's on a large flake or whether it's on a cobble or whatever. These are the distinguishing marks which is there on your NMMA form. Or you can actually get somewhat more complicated, and I think once you have the large flake and then you have this bifacial flaking, in this case this is for making a very diminutive cleaver to replicate something which we saw in the archaeological record, and of course it's much speeded up, but you can see now he's using a hard hammer and he's rotating, bifacially flaking this particular tool, and if you look at it very carefully, the edge of the tool has been created already prior to detachment of the flake, which is one of the characteristics of this type of cleaver. So you may come across something like that as well. Okay? Then your life can get even more complicated, And this video is available online, so I'll just go through one or two places uh, in this, which show you, okay, it just shows you different techniques. So we have seen this technique. Then you know obviously about bifacial flaking, in which the flakes which are coming out are sometimes also picked up and retouched into small tools. So in that case, when you get one of these small flakes, and I don't see any here on the table, but you do get at sites, they are often used differently. And then somewhat later in time, you get these more sophisticated technologies of predetermined flakes. So your job is to be able to look at the flake and identify whether it came from this complicated Levallois technology or whether it's arising from somewhere else. Now, I realize this is sometimes not possible for your NMMA documentation. Your level of identification will be simply, okay, this is just a flake. But if you wish, you can turn the flake around, look at the scar patterns on the other side, discuss with others, and add one more level to your data entry. This is not something which I will encourage right now, but just something to keep in mind. And of course, with blades, you have a whole lot of other techniques which involve not only indirect percussion, but which also may involve some aspects of pressure flaking. So now you have seen just banging and percussion, but also realize that in some of these very microblade codes, for example, there are different ways of detachment which can arise with pressure. And in some cases, the rock is also heat treated. And you can look for these diagnostic marks on the pieces that you are studying. Is the color changed? Is it become more, say, reddish tinges? Is it more shiny in some ways? Which can help you identify, especially for the late microlithic sites, whether this other method has also been used. And of course, you have your classic indirect percussion. I'll just come here, back again. So, yes, you come here to the use of both soft and hard hammer, each of which will leave their signatures on the rock, on the piece you are studying. Again, I'm saying, for this NMMA database, you don't need to write on that. You are not an expert on prehistory. It's difficult to identify, leave it. But somewhere at the back of your mind, I'm raising all these points just as a sort of background reference. It's not that you have to do everything, okay? So you have this, and you also have diverse methods of blade manufacture, which need to be considered. Now you have this general idea of the context of the site, the geomorphology, the cultural phase issues you are going to face, the technology, and now you come to typology, and this is a nuisance. Personally, just like Dr. Sheila Mishra said, in our lab, we don't just pick up a tool and give it a name. It's easy. This is a hand axe chopper, no. But I can also argue, why do I call this a chopper? Just because it has an edge? But it's also a core. It's also, I can see here the percussion marks, and I can also look at it this way and call it a core. And many of the Oldowan sites globally have pieces like this which they call cores. They do not call it a chopper. We are assuming that this is a working edge. That is our assumption. So when we are classifying typologically tools, firstly is very simple, artifact or not. The second level is where we look at the artifact in the context of its broader reduction sequence. And at the third level, only then we have to give it some name, but sometimes we don't. Sometimes, if I got a flake like this and if there's retouched, I can call it a convex scraper, concave scraper based on the shape of the working edge. But many of our typologies are borrowed from that devised in France in the 1960s. And they are totally irrelevant for India. The number of terms we use, sometimes it's fine, it's retouched, it's got a convex shape. I can call it a convex sided scraper because of the shape, but I don't need to, I can just call it retouched flake. If the retouch is more invasive, sometimes we call it a denticulate. Why? That pattern may arise intentionally or sometimes comes from use. So we have to be very cautious in giving some terminology which we have borrowed from a book written in the 1960s and which is devised from Europe. It has no relevance to India. The African systems are more valid, so it's sometimes we try to think of it in those terms, but finally in this differing ways of understanding the tool is not something simple. This is not going to be pleasant to hear because I have struggled with this in filling your NMMA forms. Sometimes in the Chennai circle, somebody brought a tool which was exactly a hand axe, no problem. Someone brought a tool which was a cleaver, I don't have that here, no problem. But you have hand axes in which people who were definitely not archaeologists and therefore didn't bother about our problems, detached a flake from the apex, making it look like a cleaver. These are tranche-ended hand axes. Some people call them cleavers, some people call them hand axes, some people call them hand axes with cleaver-like edge. And that student had a terrible time in defining it. And that's a genuine worry, it's a genuine concern. Now looking at the tool, I know what has happened because I look at the tool technologically, not typologically. But this is something for which I have no solution right now unless you have more meetings in India to decide what we are calling things. We have to call it something, otherwise we are all speaking on different pages. But it's not something that you can push into a category, and there's no need to do that. And if you do not know what it is, better to write unclear rather than write some wrong categorization. Okay? So this one. Now, it's okay if it's unclear that the second level of NMMA can refine. Now look at these pieces. These pieces are actually waste flakes coming during manufacture of a hand axe. And what they did at Rathirampakam, because there was no raw material available locally, they picked up these waste flakes, retouched it, and made it into tools. So it's not a formal convex scraper in the French system. But I have to call it something, so I call it retouched flake with convex working edge, concave. The working edge is incidental. The working edge depends on the shape of the flake, not on what went on in the mind of the fellow found a flake with a round edge, he just retouched it and used it. We are calling it convex. Should we call it convex? Should we call it round? We spend hours discussing this nonsense. But it's actually much simpler, okay? Then you come to the last bit in reading the anatomy of a flake, because most of your tools are maybe on flakes and you have to give some measurements. So why this is important is it determines how you are going to measure. Okay. So how will I measure this? Anyone wants to come and show? You have a column in which you have length, breadth, thickness, weight. Of this, weight is the easiest. That's it. Finished. Put it on weighing scale, you will get it. How will I measure this? How would you measure it? Anyone?
This is sliding caliper. So we'll take this working it to up to button, and then we measure this elbow. Oh. So we'll measure like this way. This maximum length. I think this one. Yeah, maximum length looks like that, and then reading is come almost, I think 11 centimeter. Okay. Yeah. And then maximum breadth we'll put like this way. In between, and this is L1, and this is 6.7 like that.
And then thickness. So what he's saying is fine. You don't have much time. Now when I'm measuring in my lab, I probably will take a lot more time in measuring the actual artifact. But for you, it's fine, what he has said. Now that is great for hand axes, where you know that there is a tip and there's a butt. What happens in the case of a flake? Yes, please come. Now in the case of flake, I have seen measurements which are this way, that way, anyway. The longest axis of the tool is often measured, but that's not correct. when you are measuring pieces where you have a flake, like this one, yeah, it has a definite bulb.
End flake.
Yes.
And if there is a side flake,
I don't think there is a side flake here.
it's not like that. So if this is end flake, then it's easier.
Yes.
Because it's striking platform and positive bulb of percussion. And then we'll put like this way, and this is very easy to measure. But if that is side flake,
Yes.
side stuck flake, everything I learned from madam. Anyway, so if there is a side stuck flake, then its measurement is like that, because there is a striking platform and here is the positive bulb of percussion, and that is maximum length. And maybe this one is not the maximum, it's like that. This, if I put this may be maximum length.
So what problem will they face in the database? They may get some wrong measurements. So you have to have some training in identifying and standardizing the way in which you're taking a measurement. Generally, we take measurements along the technological axis of the artifact, that is from the striking platform down. Now, if you can't identify the striking platform or do anything, please note that. Note that the measurement you have taken is the maximum length. So that in the database, people will know that this is a length, okay, but your length probably doesn't mean the same as my length. It's a very minor issue. It looks like a minor issue, but if they are trying to do research, if someone is using this database 50 years down the line for research, they will want to have accurate measurements. And when you have accurate measurement, then you need to be careful about the way you're taking it. There are ways of measuring coins. There are ways of measuring sculptures. Like that, there are rules for measuring stone tools. There are books which you can find these rules in. It's not something I've made up. It's a global language. And you can follow those books which can be prescribed as to how to measure. Now, this is traditionally, and then you all know the traditional drawings. Nowadays, we don't do that anymore. We use a lot of 3D modeling, not only for sites, but also for artifacts. So all I do nowadays in the lab, at least for the bifaces, I take them, prepare a 3D model of them, or of the cores or whatever it may be. And from this model, the data can be easily accessed by everyone, and then I can do all my calculations, whatever I want, whether it is the cores, whether it is the bifaces, I can get all the measurements at one shot. So I don't need to bother about whether I'm, it's a standardized way of getting your data. It's pretty fast, and it is a universal application. And then I can go on and generate my statistics from the 3D model itself. So this eliminates a lot of the errors which come in our traditional ways of measuring. It's not that the traditional ways are wrong, no. They are also perfectly good, and it's what we use for most of the artifacts are done this way. But in the future, as the database develops, you can think of providing main centers for scanning of certain artifacts, and then those scans can be placed online by the NMMA. Okay, so the last thing is the state of preservation. Now, this is a very important part of the database and very important clues. Now, if I show you these two hand axes, apart from the morphology, what do you see? So both are hand axes, but they are manufactured firstly very differently. They are manufactured differently, and the surface texture of these two artifacts tells you a completely different story. In this case, the tip is broken, and it is heavily abraded and patinated. So the story of what this fellow has gone through is completely different from this one, which although it has all sorts of patina, it has other marks on it, has remarkably fresh edges. So these are the next thing that you look at. You look at the surface of the tool. It tells the story of the sediment in which it was lying. It tells the story of its use, and it tells the story of ways in which it was discarded. Okay? So you will record it in terms of maybe degrees of abrasion or freshness. You will look at the patination. In this case, it's got some blackish thing. In this case, it's completely patinated. If you have a Munsell rock color chart, you can give the patina a color, and that makes the language more universal. And you can look as to whether it's complete, as in this case, or broken, as in that case. Yeah, that's what came from here. Okay, so completely different story in this tool. In this tool, it was made on a cobble which has already got some white patination on it. But when they flaked it, this is, you can see somewhat the original color of the tool, meaning it has not undergone any significant change owing to its position in the sediment subsequently. Okay, so all these things, you have a state, you have a field in which you are looking at the state of the artifact, and you're looking at what happens to it later, and all these points you need to add in. Okay. Lastly, yeah, and this is the last bit. Yeah, lastly, obviously, stone tools were used. And when the stone tools were used for whatever purposes, they leave behind marks on the edges of the tool. Do not mistake this for retouch. It's a very common error in NMMA forms, is that the natural edge damage, which can occur through fluvial action or through any other sedimentary process or trampling, animal trampling, whatever the case, is sometimes called retouch. It is not. So, some understanding you should have on how the tools were used and what the impact of use were can be on tool edges, so that you do not put this down by mistake as retouch. Okay? Is that clear? So this is the last part. And to end, the safe storage. Now this is crucial. Generally, once we put them into these plastic bags, we do not think about data retrieval. So this is something really important. So if you devise a proper storage method, that storage method should have not only all the details of the artifact as you have here in these bags, but also it should be organized in a system linked to the database, where within 5 minutes, for example, in our office, we have a system here where if I say, oh, I want to take a photograph of artifact number so-and-so, I can recover that within 5 minutes in the system which I have, actually not me, Akhilesh has devised. And if you can see here, some of the smaller artifacts are not flat, they are hanging, they are suspended. Why? This prevents damage to the smaller flakes, microliths, whatever you have. So this is a very effective way of storing. So you must think, I've collected all this, I'm creating a database, but how can my database be used to get me the data? I don't want to search for weeks to be able to find, okay, I want somebody's coming to study some site, I don't want to make them wait for weeks. They should be able to access that site immediately, so that your efficiency levels improve. So this is also something, after putting them in the bags, how are the bags going to be organized, and how is that going to be linked to your NMMA database? So someone sitting somewhere can access NMMA, see, okay, this is the collection in this institute. In that particular institute's job is to be able to have that data at their fingertips. So anyone who wants to access that data, you can provide it as fast as possible. So to conclude, when we started with that simple NMMA form, now what I just wanted you to understand, that this simple form, each column has to be thought about very, very carefully before you just write one word, cleaver. The identification marks are also something you will not be able to write unless you have an understanding of the way in which the tool was made. For example, you might say here, identification mark flake scars. Now everything has a scar. This is there in some papers. Which flake scar is important and distinct from that found in some other tool? Or which attribute part of this artifact can distinguish it from something else. Okay, so that comes to that column. Lastly, the photography. Obviously, in your photography, you will always have a scale there, but the photograph, and this is not coming out very clearly here, but the photograph should be able to identify each and every scar on both faces. And if you need more faces, you should take more. To be able to give a total perspective so that the person reviewing the form will be able to look at the photograph and give a judgment as to whether you are correct or not. So the identification marks become also very crucial to zoom in when you are taking the actual photo. So you can give an additional little sort of little shot of a zoom in of what you feel is a distinguishing mark of that particular artifact. Okay, so that's all what I had to say. And I think you can come here and have a look at the artifacts also and test your skill. Avik, can you take yours?